What is up, guys, and welcome back to Dawn of Man episode number 10. Guys, we hit the big number 10, and today we're talking about a really exciting topic. Last week we talked about how transportation is really shifting the way our world works, the way we perceive the world. And this is exactly what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the post-state world. A world in which there may no longer be borders. A world in which there's seamless, trade, travel, and communication, where we no longer associate ourselves with being citizens of that country or this country, where we really isolate ourselves from one another, but much rather have open borders, open gates to really, unite as one unit. And the way I want to get into this is first looking at how the world has done this in the past. You see, the world really works in cycles. We've gone from big empires down to small city-states, back to big empires and falling apart. A couple good examples of this is how Rome first started, it built its way up to being this huge empire, and then later, after a lot of internal problems, a lot of internal division, it split into two Roman empires, which over time declined more and more and more until it no longer existed. The same thing happened, in the Middle Ages. Certain empires, started as small kingdoms and built their way up to become bigger empires. And again, we had this as late as, the Ottoman Empire, which was huge in the entire East. And then, as of World War I, it was, taken apart. And we really saw a lot of this. The last time we had these great empires was previous to World War I, where we were in the age of colonialism, in the age of imperialism. And since then, we were for maybe 100 years on a decline where we were separating ourselves again. But now, once more, we're in the age of unifying. We have the United States, a huge, super union. We have the European Union, another huge mega state, so to say, where multiple different countries are governed under a agreed set of rules with open borders. The same thing could be said about the United Nations, which essentially has the whole globe under its wing. But of course, with having the whole globe under its wing, you have very hard time, actually coming to conclusions, coming to agreements, and making decisions that can actually govern the world. However, with something like the United Nations, we have the certain set of rules where we say, look, this is the minimum that we agree upon. The minimum of, for example, human rights. The minimum of laws of war that we can agree upon, so that we don't breach these certain rules and really can treat each other with a certain level of respect and understanding, where we know, look, no matter where I go in the world, this is how I will be treated. And right now we're a really interesting tipping point, a really interesting cusp, where a lot of these mega nations, whether it's the United States, the European Union, or even the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, that are all coming together to govern together. Because those countries right now, these mega states, so to say, are at this tipping point where we can go one of two ways. Already now we see a lot of division within these mega states. In the United States, there's several states, they've been talking about the previous decade about seceding from the union. Perhaps they're doing economically well while everybody else is doing economically poorly, or perhaps we're just so split on certain issues. Some states are socially left, some states are socially right, and we simply cannot come to the table. So there's been a lot of talk, within the United States, not as serious as one might think, about seceding from the union, but this might be something that becomes a lot more serious down the road. And even in the EU, over the past 10 years, we've seen a lot of this happen. Whether it's right after the sovereign debt crisis, where multiple countries, urged for countries such as Greece, to withdraw from the union, or we had, Britain with Brexit already withdraw from the union, and a lot of other countries are talking about, why don't they just get out of the union? Because the problem is that, a lot of the poorer countries, the countries not doing so well economically, feel like, the bigger countries are like ruling over them. And on the flip side, you have the wealthier countries that are doing well economically, basically funding the whole thing. So the taxpayers say, why are we paying for everybody else while our own country still has problems? So we see a lot of that across the world right now, where many countries, and more than countries, many regions say, look, I affiliate with my region, I affiliate with my city, I don't care about the problems of these other people out there, let's focus on our stuff and let's separate. So the first of two ways that the superstates can go right now is that we kind of go back to the city-state model, where we really go from, for example, the United States to perhaps, Florida as a state, perhaps California as a state, or with California, perhaps even South California as a state of its own. So that we have a more bigger splintering of this political power, going away from the big model towards a more focused and really more micro-focused one. Because when we talk about borders, really, we're talking about two main controls. One, the rules underlying the territory within, and secondly, the right to tax. Those are really the main factors that apply when we talk about borders, is, what are the rules within these borders, and also, who gets to tax. And I think a lot of states would much rather have both of the following, because A, if they can set their own rules and they don't agree with the people all the way over there across the world essentially, then they can have their own rules. They can have rules that actually match their culture, rules that actually match their lifestyles. At the same time with taxes, if they're doing really well, they're not paying for all the other people that aren't doing as hot. So this might work, for the certain areas that are doing well. It will create a lot more hardships, of course, for the areas that aren't doing as economically well. The bottom line is that this would actually be a step away from, the type of open border world, the type of world where we have, the free trade and everything, because if we have all these small states with their own little rules, it makes it a lot harder. Unless, of course, we have a combination of the two scenarios. So before we get to the combination, let's talk about the second scenario. The second scenario, of course, would be the expansion of the superstates. What if we, instead, of having, the US against the BRICS, or maybe the US and the EU against the BRICS, and all that kind of that's happening right now, what if, we have one really big superstate where we say, you can travel to any country in the world, but as with the UN, for example, these are the rules governing the world. It would have to be very simplified. It could not be as thorough as we have right now with the countries. But if we're honest with ourselves, a lot of the bureaucracy that exists right now is truthfully and genuinely useless. A lot of that could be, re-pushed to the private sector, and we could really, simplify things, especially as we move towards this future that we've been talking about so much. If we get to the point of, really economic prosperity because of automation, where everybody can get UBI, where we have, clean renewable energies without a limit because, we have a lot of, solar plants and so on, then we might be in a stage where, we could have this global world because we can technically fight we can raise the bottom layer of poverty to a certain level of comfort where everybody lives at least at this level, and then everything above can be simply, ruled and governed by the private sector. So that's definitely a possibility, and this really also goes hand in hand with the video we made about plutocracy. Because if we're going towards a world where we say, look, at the very least, these are the things we agree upon. These are the minimum standards that we want to enforce for every single human on Earth. And that honestly is not as expensive as you might think, because the minimum is not, the minimum is the minimum. We spend, for example, in the United States, excessive amounts of money on really silly things, such as, government-funded football stadiums and so on. Stuff like that doesn't need to happen. Instead, if we move it towards the private sector, which is the trend that's already happening right now with a lot of private companies, especially in the tech sector, having incredible amounts of power, incredible amounts of money, then this would be the kind of path that we're going to. And one of the ways this global mega government could work is in fact with the blockchain, for example. And I know I'm a big crypto advocate, but this is actually something that is already, several countries are looking into, where you wouldn't necessarily even need, multiple different, elected officials running the world, but much rather, what if everybody in the world gets a vote? What if we all can come to a consensus together? And this is something, consensus is the basic underlying idea of, blockchain governing models, of how we can all come to the table together and come to an agreement without needing a centralized force to run it. However, it's important to keep in mind that governments of all things work incredibly, incredibly slow. So seeing something like, the disappearance of the governments as we know them, moving towards, a global world order, sounds menacing, as many people put it with the Illuminati and all that, it will take a while. Those kind of bureaucratic moves don't happen fast, but I do see the mix of both scenario 1 and 2 happen over the coming 3 decades, where we have an increase in global governance, where we increase the kind of levels because of things like in our communication, because of social media and all that, we're so much more aware of what is happening around the world than we used to be. And because we're so aware, we're also becoming less and less tolerant to accepting these truths, these radical truths of how, we're worrying about, like, which handbag to buy or which Lambo to drive and all the kind of stuff that's happening in the first world. Well, there's literally civil wars, there's real famine, all these things are happening around the world, and with social media, they're becoming inescapable. So I think we will become a lot more warm-hearted, a lot more open to helping one another in the coming 3 years, and we'll really raise the standard of what are the human rights, the minimum acceptable levels of decency, so to say, globally, while at the same time most likely facing a splintering of the governing bodies that we live in right now. In fact, I do not believe that the United States will still have 50 states 30 years from now. I do think that in 50 years, aside from Puerto Rico perhaps joining, maybe 1, 2, or 3 states will perhaps secede from the Union. I think that is a very high likelihood, simply because of the cultural shift that we're seeing in this country. There's a lot of disagreements, there's a lot of division, and sooner rather than later, somebody will take action and somebody will separate. And sometimes, as with breakups in relationships, sometimes breakups are not the worst thing. Sometimes it would be the healthy thing to do for a country. So it comes without judgment, but that's basically the trend that we're seeing. And the same thing can be said for the European Union. In fact, I think it needs to be seen whether or not the European Union will remain the way it is even in 10 years. But much rather, I could see perhaps an alliance of Central European countries. I believe Germany and France will continue working together for a while. But the further out you go, for example, like Germany and some Eastern European countries, or perhaps like those are likely not to work together as much, or perhaps you see an alliance between Mediterranean countries, whatever it is. But the superstate, I think, is really facing its final years, because we cherish it for about 2 decades now with Europe. We've had the euro since the early 2000s, but it's not working out the way we want it to. So with the falling of power of the superstate, I think we're moving towards a lot more, the countries as we know them, or even within countries, breaking apart into smaller city-states, the way, Greece happened back in the day. Because that will allow a lot more autonomy, which is something we're really moving towards. If people within a certain region have very unique cultural standards, very unique, economic standards, then they will want to enforce them. And with all the tools, technologies that we have nowadays, it's becoming more and more feasible where that city-state would no longer need to have all this crazy bureaucracy, but much rather we would be able to have, enforce all the rules that the community would want to live under, while at the same time enforcing some global rules. So as I said, in the unified version of the two, we'd have the global rules, we'd have the smaller countries, city-states, whatever you want to call them, but overall, we would still have something like, non-aggression agreements. We would have some pacts, because obviously the biggest question that people would say is like, look, Felix, well, if Florida secedes from the union, if California secedes from the union, and if somebody were to invade California, then like they wouldn't have the army to protect themselves. Well, yeah, that is definitely a fact. Because of because of having superstates, we also have basically unbeatable militaries. But that doesn't change the fact that we could, for example, even with that, still have some kind of pacts. We could have defense agreements, where we say, look, if we will all run our own show. But should anybody attack, this city or the state, then we all defend together. And this, in fact, is what happened before, the Declaration of Independence that was signed, as far as I remember. That a lot of the states were, working together on very thin strings. They all had their own governments. They all had their own, taxation and all that. But when it comes to mutual defense, there's a lot of collaboration that's been happening all the way from the ancient Greece to the modern United States before joining as a union. So with that, the future certainly holds a lot of changes, and some of these changes they can either come to fruition through economic calamities or through straight up war. It will take, without a doubt, extreme situations for us to see change in the political landscape. It won't come during sunny days. it will most definitely come during a storm. And the storm is impending one way or the other. We see storms already now happening in the financial landscape with over leveraging. If we have another 2008 crisis, perhaps even grander, as many financial analysts predict, then this is one of the many possibilities of how we can end up in the post-state world. Well, alternatively, and I really hope it doesn't come that far, that a war actually pulls us apart. And these wars, they could be, international, but they might as well be domestic. You see many times, and especially now in the 21st century, we don't see as many international wars as we see civil wars. If we think about the real political changes that have been happening over the past decade, especially with the Arab Spring, every single time it wasn't the outside forces, but much rather it was internal uprising. It was internal dissatisfaction with the way the countries were run that brought the political change. And something like that I can see for many other countries. Right now, things aren't bad enough for that to happen. But give it another decade, 2 decades, or 3 decades, when cultural shifts start kicking in and when, economic struggles come to an all-time high, then even in the civilized Western world, we may start seeing some civil wars rise again. Because historically, history and politics work in cycles. And we're really approaching, the final years, the final decades, so to say, of the unified world. Because in the past, these empires, they're built, they rise, and they fall. And then from the ashes, after some years, unison comes again. We rise and fall again. But right now, after almost 100 years of unity, as with the United Nations, or then of nearly 3 centuries of American unity, it will really become a question of how long and how many pressures and stresses the union can survive. So it's left for us to see. And what is important for us to recognize is what we can do in order to be, as always, on the right side of things. How we can make sure that we see some of these struggles, some of these divisions early on and tackle them. Because it's just as much our politicians' job as it's our own to ensure that we do not end up in a civil war or an international war, so that we take care of some of these differences right now. Because differences truly, and this is one of the catch-22s of politics, is we feel powerless as an individual. But truly, even as a politician, you're even more powerless, because you might have the right ideas, you might have the right solutions, but those solutions don't mean anything if the individuals that you're going to rule over, so to say, have personal vendettas, right? If blood has been shed for a person, then they don't care how logically smart a decision or a solution might seem, because it's only in their mind, their emotions are so closely tied to it. So if we, in our day-to-day lives, even though we're not politicians, can make sure that, if we see people with certain prejudices against others, that we tackle them, that we confront them, and that we say, that we bring them back together, that we bring them back to the table. Because right now, it's still solvable. But if we let that rift get bigger and bigger and bigger, it will be the original seed that will cause this division that might lead to the falling apart of the nations we live in. And with that, with the falling apart of nations, we face war, we face struggle, we face rebuilding. And while sometimes rebuilding can be good, there's a lot of blood on the path to rebuilding. So guys, I hope you like this episode. Again, it's not what we want, it's not what I hope, it's simply where I see things going. So I hope you learned something from this episode. Leave me your thoughts of where you think the political landscape is evolving, and whether you think it would be better us all living under a global, decentralized world, with simple rules that we can all live by and agree upon, or whether you say, we're all so different, let us all rule ourselves. Let us all have small communities of city-states where we live with people that we agree upon, that we all live, you could say now within our own bubbles, but sometimes it's not bad living in your own bubble if it makes you happy, So whatever political system you think would be ideal for us, let me know below, and also how you think we can get there. Anyways, I'll see you next time.